Introduction to Philosophy, Lecture 25, Epistemic Injustice. As we've discussed previously, many times branches of philosophy can overlap. We've experienced a lot of overlap between metaphysics and epistemology, but we've also tried to avoid branching off into ethics, since this is a knowledge and reality course, though we've failed at this a couple of times. For example, when we discussed free will and determinism, it would have been possible to leave out considerations for moral responsibility, but it would have been unreasonable. Moral responsibility is too obvious of a consequence to leave out of a metaphysical discussion of free will and determinism. However, it's not impossible. But once we find something like epistemic injustice, it's quite difficult to neglect. Historically, dating back to Aristotle, there has seemed to be a clear division between intellectual and moral virtues. However, Miranda FRICKER seems to have found virtues that violate this division. Since Aristotle dominated Western thought for thousands of years, and since, in that time, the division of the virtues has not been widely challenged, the fact that FRICKER's view challenges who Dante called the master of those who know, and who Aquinas called the philosopher, is substantial and worth examining. Indeed, every time we can find a way to advance beyond Aristotle is a reason for celebration. For better or for worse, Aristotle's view on virtue was different from his predecessors. Even though Socratic virtue ethics permeated Platonic and Aristotelian ethics, Aristotle's were unique. Aristotle broke from Plato's dyadic conception of each virtue existing in opposition to a singular vice by arguing that moral or character virtue existed in a triadic relationship between two vices, namely one vice of excess and one vice of defect or deficiency. For Aristotle, so-called intellectual virtues remained dyadic. For example, wisdom is an intellectual virtue, and it exists in a dyadic relationship with the vice of foolishness. This could be because intellectual virtue aims at truth, which has only one opposite, namely falsity. But character, or moral virtues, exist in a triadic relationship between vices of excess and defect. For example, the moral virtue courage resides between the excess vice of rashness or foolhardiness and the defect vice of cowardice. For Aristotle, justice is when people find the virtuous middle ground, or golden mean, between moral vices. Therefore, moral virtues aim at justice. FRICKER seems to have identified virtues that violate this traditional division. One of these virtues is what she calls testimonial justice. Testimonial justice is FRICKER's antidote to the vice she calls testimonial injustice. Testimonial injustice occurs when someone attempts to share knowledge with someone else, but the listener's prejudice affords the speaker less credibility than the speaker deserves. For example, a sexist person may ascribe little credibility to a woman offering information about cars, or to a man offering information about feminism, and a racist person may ascribe little credibility to a person of color offering information about theoretical physics, or to a white person offering information about equity or equality. There is moral and intellectual viciousness occurring in all of these situations. There is intellectual, or epistemic, vice in hindering the flow of knowledge from the knower to the prejudiced hearer, and there is moral vice in the prejudice towards the speaker who is disrespected as a knower or as a legitimate source of knowledge. Therefore, testimonial justice is both a moral and intellectual virtue. The second virtue FRICKER identifies is what she calls hermeneutical injustice. Hermeneutical injustice isn't as straightforward as testimonial justice, as it depends on kinds of hidden variables. It occurs when someone is trying to make sense of a social situation, but is hindered due to a gap in collective understanding of the person's social group, what she calls a hermeneutical lacuna, which I interpret as an interpretational gap. The example Fricker gives is the difficulty of making sense of homosexual desire as a legitimate sexual orientation in a cultural historical context where homosexuality is interpreted as perverse or shameful. In such contexts, according to Fricker, the gay subject cannot make proper sense of his sexuality owing to the fact that gay people, as such, were prevented from making a full contribution to the collective resources for social meaning, with the result that the forms of understanding available for making sense of homosexuality were crucially uninformed and distorted. Of course, this doesn't need to be limited to sexuality. Similar examples can be imagined for presumably any marginalized group. For example, it wouldn't be difficult to imagine interpretational gaps for the collective understanding of first generation citizens of a country born to immigrant parents in a small first generation community. Indeed, the wider society may provide experiences that are difficult to make sense of, if that society is markedly different from the person's home country. Fricker analyzes the wrong done by this kind of injustice in terms of what she calls situated hermeneutical inequality, that is, the lived experience of being unfairly disadvantaged in rendering one's social experiences intelligible to others and possibly even to oneself. Since hermeneutical injustice can impact testimonial exchanges and communication, it also calls for a corrective virtue, hermeneutical justice. In hermeneutical justice, Fricker says, the hearer succeeds in picking up on the fact that the speaker's lack of intelligibility is not her fault. It is due to the unfairly impoverished interpretational resources she is working with. Fricker argues quite succinctly for the hybridity of these virtues. She explains each in turn. Testimonial justice, when conceived of as an intellectual virtue, ultimately aims at truth, but more immediately aims at neutralizing one's prejudice in the credibility of judgments. When conceived of as a moral virtue, ultimately aims at justice, but more immediately aims at neutralizing one's prejudice in credibility judgments. Her conclusion is that since the immediate ends are the same, the virtues are the same. Similarly, when hermeneutical justice is conceived of as an intellectual virtue, it aims ultimately at understanding, but more immediately it aims at neutralizing the impact of structural prejudice in the collective hermeneutical resource. When conceived of as a moral virtue, it ultimately aims at justice, but more immediately it aims again at neutralizing the impact of structural prejudice in the collective hermeneutical resource. So again, she reasons, same immediate end, same virtue. Though identifying this virtue hybridity is exciting, it shouldn't be shocking. After all, this is a feminist and Aristotelian account of virtue, and according to Aristotelian virtue ethics, the good is grounded in reason. And since the good, a moral concept, is grounded in reason, an intellectual concept, it makes sense that some virtues might enjoy some moral and intellectual overlap. While testimonial justice seems obviously beneficial and conceptually applicable, hermeneutical justice seems more opaque and perhaps even risky. In testimonial justice, we need to be conscientious and conscious of our biases, listen to people's testimonies, and logically give what they have to say its due diligence, which may mean that everyone needs to learn logic in order to be epistemically moral, but that's a different conversation. In hermeneutical justice, the hearer needs to correct for any perceived influence of structural prejudice in social interpretive resources by adjusting credibility levels appropriately to the hermeneutical handicap incurred by the speaker. Not only is that a mouthful, it's also not clear that we could accurately perceive the influence of structural prejudice in social interpretive resources that may be hermeneutically handicapping the speaker. Attempting to conduct hermeneutical justice may run the risk of us committing testimonial injustice if we erroneously conclude that we need to adjust credibility levels based on a perceived handicap that doesn't exist. It's also not clear what that adjustment would be like. Though pursued from goodwill, the very act of presuming we know what unfairly impoverished interpretive resources someone is working with and why could be interpreted as prejudice, be that prejudice racism, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and so on, depending on the situation. We would indeed be aiming for virtue, but it seems an epistemic consequence of our metaphysical condition that we can't actually know their interpretational gaps or their unfairly impoverished interpretational resources, or however many or however few in either case. If we could know, it would still be through our own veils of epistemic perception, in the context of the world as we understand it. Of course, my concerns may be unjustified, as this is a new concept to me that I find a little bit complicated. So I wouldn't endorse an argument like the one I've just briefly set out without first reading her entire book and giving her view its just deserts. But if we grant that these concerns are not consequences of her actual argument when it is properly understood, and we have enough time with someone, hermeneutical justice may not be so difficult. Indeed, if we take the time to get to know each other before passing moral and intellectual judgments, we can be more just and more accurate. After all, we don't all know each other's backgrounds, and we can't read each other's minds. We can't tell by looking at each other what interpretational gaps we may have as a result of our upbringings, cultures, or other social factors. We can't tell how others want to be communicated with, how they need to be communicated with, or how they want to be treated by looking at them either. It seems the best we can do is start with the golden rule and practice testimonial justice and give ourselves a chance to get to know each other. But if we don't give each other a chance, we can never likely move beyond the golden rule. And that's really what the golden rule is, a starting point, and testimonial justice is part of that. There have been multiple formulations of the rule from all over the world throughout history in almost every social, philosophical, and religious tradition. The most common in the Western world is a positive formulation that advises us to treat others as we want to be treated, and I don't think it's far-fetched to suppose that would include respect as knowers or as legitimate sources of knowledge. There are other formulations as well, though. One that has come to be called the Silver Rule is the negative formulation, don't treat others in a way that you wouldn't want to be treated. I also don't think it's far-fetched to suppose that people don't like it when they're disrespected on account of someone else's prejudice. The last formulation I'm going to leave you with is the one that takes time. It requires us to give each other a chance and get to know each other. This is what has come to be known as the Platinum Rule. Treat others the way they want to be treated. We all have unique backgrounds, with our own interpretational gaps, but if we come together in reason and in good faith, we can learn how others want to be treated. In the United States, we may make a new friend and shake hands, while in Spain, it could be a kiss on the cheek. At first, these differences may seem strange to us, and even throw us initially. But as we take the time to get to know each other, we can learn that this friend prefers a handshake, this friend prefers a bow, and yet another wants a hug. So, even though the Platinum Rule sounds like a tall order, because we can't know how other people want to be treated, the epistemic and moral solution isn't any different from the process of making friends. We just need to give each other a chance.